This is La Higuera, where Che Guevara was shot dead by the CIA. Now, to come here, I've had to have jabs for typhoid, dengue fever, yellow fever, diphtheria, rabies. I've had malaria tablets. They've got poisonous snakes, deadly spiders and flies that eat you from the inside. Why did the CIA bother to shoot him? He'd not even had any jabs. If they'd left him another week, he'd have been stung by a poisonous beetle that would have laid eggs on his liver that would have hatched and burst out of his arse. Now, Che Guevara has become an image, displayed by many people who probably know very little about him. It's as if he's got an interesting face, so it doesn't really matter what he stands for. Even his name sounds like a perfect marketing logo, punchy and memorable, although Che is just the Argentine word for mate, which suggests why no revolutionary icon has ever come from Swanley, because you can't have a hero called Oi Mush! Ernesto Guevara was born in 1928 in the small Argentine town of Alta Gracia, at a time when the country was becoming a modern industrial nation, but with an old political structure dominated by big landowning families. So workers had no rights, the law was kept by vigilantes, and leprosy was common. But the trade unions were growing, and Che's father was one of many who organised support for the Spanish Republic against the dictator Franco. Nonetheless, in typical small-town fashion, when Che was born, his parents falsified his birth certificate to cover up for the fact that he was conceived 3 months before they were married. Something else that may have shaped his character was his condition as a chronic asthmatic. Some days he could hardly move at all, one attack nearly killed him, and his family tried every remedy that was suggested, including making him sleep with a stray cat.
Buenos días, señor.
On the night that Che lost his virginity to a woman called Cabrera, he had to stop to take puffs on his inhaler.
So, what do you think? Shall we,
He began studying to become a doctor, but like most teenagers with a bit of spark living in a small town, he wanted to travel. So with his mate Alberto, he planned a journey through South and Central America on a bike called La Poderosa, which means the power. And Che kept a record of his journey, which he called the Motorcycle Diaries. Again, the diaries can seem like the ramblings of a laddish student. He gets drunk and fails to get off with women. They get caught stealing drink from parties. And they stay in a farmhouse where they shoot a wild puma that growls at them before realising they've shot the farmer's dog by mistake.
No, Pedrito!
No, this
Pendejos! Pendejos, carajos! No!
Most editions of the book show Che lying on a bed with his top off, as if he's posing for an advert for Gap. This image of the Motorcycle Diaries is probably a result of the way that most people think about revolutionaries as pious and robotic, with no interest in normal human pursuits. So it's assumed that Che was being a lad, and then later had some sort of conversion that turned him into an obsessive rebel.
Power to the people!
But look closer at the Motorcycle Diaries and you'll see that although it is a story of lads on the road, it is a story of a certain type. At one point, Che gets a job as a doctor in the small town of La Gioconda, and he writes about the plight of some of his patients.
I went to see an old woman with asthma. The smell of stale sweat filled her room, mixed with the dust from a couple of armchairs, the only luxuries in her house.
But the reason Che mentioned her wasn't just because of her illness.
In circumstances like this, a doctor longs for a change that would prevent the injustice of a system in which, until a month ago, this poor old woman had to earn her living as a waitress, wheezing and panting, but facing life with dignity.
Che's travels enhanced the ideological journey that he was making. He wanted fun, but he felt this should be available to everyone, and his compassion led to a deep sense of injustice about those who were denied it.
So, Che, what are you rebelling against?
As these ideas developed, he planned another trip to Guatemala. Now, in 1953, Central America was virtually a colony of the United States. The major industry in the region was bananas, run by the American multinational, the United Fruit Company. So each nation was run by a dictator who answered to the White House. The one exception was Guatemala, where the leader nationalised the fruit industry and installed trade union rights. The place developed a liberal air and it attracted exiles from the rest of Central America and Che. And while he was there, he met Hilda Gadea, an American activist who introduced him to a circle of revolutionaries. And together they would spend the evenings reading Freud and Mao, and they fell in love. Though it's hard to see how reading Mao could be romantic. Power comes from the barrel of a gun. But the defiant atmosphere that fuelled this love was not to last. The Americans planned to overthrow Arbenz and privatise the fruit industry. And the man that they put in charge of this operation was John Foster Dulles, who by coincidence happened to be a major shareholder in the United Fruit Company. The Americans announced that
In Guatemala, democracy is unrealistic.
So they were saying it's unrealistic because you'll vote for someone that we don't like and then we'll just have to invade you. The Americans prepared to bomb Guatemala and install as new leader a furniture salesman called Castillo Armas. And as the air raids began, Che wrote to his mother,
The bombardments make me lick my lips with pleasure. I'm having as much fun as a monkey.
Che's excitement was a result of his belief that the Guatemalan government would arm the population and defeat the Americans. But instead, within a few days, Arbenz had surrendered in humiliation and the new president was the furniture salesman.
Como su presidente, les traeré estabilidad, comodidad y camas por la mitad. Mesa, 50% de descuento. Este comedor, solo $50. Precios locos, locos, locos.
Union rights were abolished, striking dockers were shot and the Americans were back in charge of the United Fruit Company. Anyone associated with the opposition was arrested, including Che and Hilda. That's why it's not easy to believe the Americans when they say they're invading somewhere to make it more democratic. It's a bit like these commentators who said they supported the Americans going into Iraq because they thought it would help democracy. And now they've changed their mind as it's all gone wrong. And a bit of me thinks, well, fair enough, at least they've owned up. But another bit of me wants to put them all in a classroom and sit in front of them going, come along, we've been through this enough times before. We ought to know it by now. What happens when the Americans invade somewhere, you boy? Come on, out with it. They screw everything up and make things worse, sir. That's right, they screw everything up and make things worse. Now learn it for next time.
Sí, señor. Los americanos no sirven. Son abusivos.
Sí, señor.
Che and Hilda were thrown out of the country. At this point, some radicals concluded that the mistake had been to be radical in the first place, whereas others, like Che, decided that Arbenz hadn't been radical enough. Che began to develop the idea that a group of people should be assembled who would be prepared to start a war against dictatorial governments. Shortly afterwards, he was staying at a house in Mexico, which I would imagine must have villages similar to this one in Bolivia. While he was at the house, a group of militants who'd been expelled from Cuba arrived, including Raul Castro, followed by his brother Fidel. One night, Hilda asked Fidel why he was in Mexico, and apparently Fidel replied with a 4-hour monologue.
And this brings me to one of the most important points I want to make, 27C, the crisis in the beetroot industry. Put quite simply.
And that's what he's been like for the last 45 years, making speeches that go on for 4, 5, 6 hours. I wonder if when he gets to 90 he'll go, anyway, that's enough about me, now let's hear about you. The regime the Castros were exiled from was run by Fulgencio Batista, and it thrived on one major industry, corruption. There were 10,000 pimps. And Batista was master of all of this. 1/3 of all public payments were made back to him.
Go buy yourself something nice.
Castro had a plan for an uprising which entailed training a crack squad of rebels based in the countryside. And this plan appealed to Che in that it didn't mean waiting for a revolution, but just going ahead and doing it, even if there was only a handful of you. But also, throughout Che's youth, national liberation movements had mobilised millions of people across Africa and Asia, and one by one these movements were winning. Castro's offer must have seemed tremendously exciting to a newly converted activist, as it was an offer to help lead the Cuban version of that global movement. Also, you can tell how single-minded Che was becoming from the letter that he wrote to his parents. After several pages discussing the latest coup in Argentina, at the very bottom he wrote,
"And I communicate the news that I married Hilda Gadea, and we shall have a child."
To start with, the attempt to take over Cuba was a classic left-wing fiasco, the sort that makes lefties wish that the other side was just as disorganised. 82 rebels set out on a boat called the Granma, which Castro had bought second-hand. And in Che's account of the boat journey to Cuba, he wrote,
"We had very bad weather. We sang the Cuban national anthem for 5 minutes total, then began a frantic search for antihistamines for seasickness and could not find them. Men with anguished faces were holding their stomachs, some with their heads in buckets, and others lying immobile on the deck in the strangest positions, with their clothing soiled by vomit."
They got lost for 2 days, and as they approached their landing spot, the navigator fell overboard. They struck a sandbar, so had to abandon their supplies and wander to shore through a swamp. Then they walked round and round in circles, following the one member of the crew who said he knew the way, but he got them even more lost. So the Cuban Air Force spotted them and attacked them. Che was shot, but he was eventually one of 22 survivors, and he referred to his thoughts afterwards.
"During the battle I felt a need to live. This is a weakness I must correct."
For the next bit of the story, I've come to the Che Guevara Museum in Valle Grande that tells the story of Che's life, except that it doesn't mention Cuba at all, only Bolivia. Well, it does mention it once, but even then it's in brackets. So, to redress the balance a bit. Now, the Cuba campaign had obviously started disastrously, and Che must have become acquainted with the reality of his own probable death. So he set off into the forest with the aim of overthrowing the government, although there was now just him and 21 of his followers. His method was to train his group in hit-and-run attacks on remote government buildings and barracks, collecting food and ammunition as they went, and he described one typical day as
hunger and thirst, weariness, the feeling of impotence against enemy forces, and above all, terrible foot disease. We spent our hardest days with no water, our shoes demolished, living in a stinking swamp.
The guerrilla army became more efficient and more ruthless, especially Che. When he discovered that one of his group had been collaborating with the enemy, Che wrote in his diary,
"I ended the problem giving him a shot with a .32 caliber pistol in the right side of the brain with exit orifice in the right temporal lobe. It was wet that night and I had asthma."
Che's unit retreated into the mountains, from where they made frequent raids, winning the support of the peasants as they proved themselves capable of inflicting defeats on the government. Part of the reason for this support was their promise to hand over land once they'd taken power. They produced vouchers and distributed them to each farmer, and the vouchers could be cashed in once the rebels had taken control. And eventually around 3,000 peasants joined the rebel army. The old regime, ruled by Batista, had few supporters, and there were no institutions that were prepared to take over in his place. The church was weak, and the official opposition party had become discredited because their leader had had his own radio show, and one week, at the end of his programme, he shot himself. I hope Cuban radio was as unflappable as Radio 4, because then you'd have just heard... That was the last in the series by the leader of the opposition. So on the 1st of January 1959, a few thousand rebels marched into Havana and Batista and the mafia fled. And on that day, Errol Flynn was sailing in the Caribbean Sea. And when he heard about Castro and Che's victory, he sailed to Havana and climbed onto the balcony with Cuba's new leaders. See, this is the sort of thing that gives the Cuban Revolution such a cool image. Day of liberation, Errol Flynn arrives. If a similar thing happened in Britain, you'd get Blakey from On the Buses going, "Oh, I hate you, Batista. I really do." Shea was made Foreign Minister, which wasn't bad as he'd only set out on holiday. And that was 5.5 years earlier. So, to get that in perspective, the escalator at Brixton Underground Station was once busted for more than 5.5 years. So it took longer for them to fix that than it did for Shea to travel round the continent, get bombed till he was as happy as a monkey, get married, have a kid, live in a swamp, shoot traitors, take over Cuba and stand on a balcony with Errol Flynn. And his next problem was dealing with his family. His parents turned up, so while he was trying to rebuild the country, his mum and dad were put up in a hotel in Havana. And his dad was a classic dad. One of the first things he said to Shea was,
"So Shea, what are you going to do with your medical career now?"
"He's not the Foreign Minister. He's a very naughty boy. Now go away."
Even more complicated, while Shea was running his base in the mountains, he'd met a peasant woman called Aleida, who'd run special missions for the guerrillas. She referred to herself as middle class because she'd been brought up on a farm with a concrete floor, whereas all her friends had slept on dirt floors. Shea and Aleida became an item. Unaware of this, Hilda turned up expecting to carry on their marriage. Shea, who had lived in a swamp, faced countless gun battles and felt he had to correct his need to live, was so terrified that he sent his mates to meet her at the airport. Despite these and other problems, the new government was hugely popular. Cuba had been notoriously illiterate, but now students were sent into the villages to teach the peasants how to read, and as a result of this, illiteracy was more or less wiped out within a year. And the new leaders were brilliant at winding up America. When Fidel was invited to the United Nations Assembly in New York, he turned up in combat gear, and he refused to stay in his allotted hotel and stayed instead in a rundown area of Harlem as an act of solidarity with black civil rights. Acts like these irritated the Americans, and then Castro nationalised the oil.
Oil the wheels of your revolution.
With Castro GTX.
Now, here's a quiz. When a radical government nationalises oil that used to belong to American multinationals, is the American government A, pleased, or B, cross? Well, the answer is that America retaliated by refusing to buy any more Cuban sugar. So Cuba arranged a loan from communist Russia. Now, Castro had often expressed his dislike for communism, and he saw the loan as a necessity, whereas Shea had sometimes called himself a Marxist. So the CIA kept a file on him containing information such as,
"Shea is fairly intellectual for a Latino."
Following the nationalisation of land and oil, America broke off relations. Then anti-Castro groups, backed by the Americans, burnt down the largest department store in Havana. The next morning, a bombing raid started, which must have seemed to Shea almost identical to the one that he'd seen in Guatemala. He went to the west coast of the island, just 90 miles from the coast of America, to organise the defence. An exile from a wealthy landowning family, Felix Rodriguez, set up the invasion, but the result was that 1,500 American soldiers arrived in boats at the Playa Giron, which the Americans called the Bay of Pigs, and they got stuck in a swamp. The Americans called on the radio for reinforcements, but none arrived, and instead they were either shot or taken prisoner. They were humiliated, but the Cubans decided that their best defence for the future was to become an ally of Russia. Now, one of the most extraordinary things about Shea at this point was that in effect he was the joint leader of the Cuban National Liberation Movement, and yet he was one of the most un-Cuban people imaginable. He didn't drink, he didn't dance, he hardly smoked, and his favourite method of relaxation was doing maths. He wrote a series of letters to the press complaining that the chess puzzles were too easy. And he was proudly monogamous with Aleida, and they had 3 kids together. Around this time, there seemed to be a tension between Che and Fidel. Castro took the view that Cuba should be pragmatic and keep Russia on its side, whereas Che was becoming suspicious of them and wanted to seek allies beyond Russia, and that would require another Cuba-style revolution in a different country. As he toured the world meeting leaders of other ex-colonies, he decided that the most fruitful place to try and start another revolution would be the Congo. Just think how extraordinary this is. The deputy leader of a country, an international figure, goes off to fight a guerrilla war, subjecting himself for the second time to the most unimaginable hardship. A war of independence had been thwarted when the Belgians, who ruled the Congo, along with mercenaries, murdered 30,000 people. So Che decided to restart the war along with a tiny band of colleagues. Nobody, not even the people that he went with, was to know who he was. He had to have his appearance completely altered. He had false lips made and his beard shaved off.
Once in the Congo, he formed a group of about 40 rebels. But this was going to be incomparably harder than the relatively simple task of overthrowing the old regime in Cuba. Che's initial briefing with his new troops didn't really go to plan. He wrote in his diary,
Lieutenant Colonel Lambert explained to me that they weren't worried about enemy planes because they possessed dawa, a medicine that made them immune to bullets.
The first battle was a fiasco in which 4 of the soldiers were killed, after which the rest of the army blamed the witch doctor for supplying them with bad dawa.
Tell my date! Tell my
The farce of the expedition was matched only by the farce of the CIA's efforts to find out where Che was. A report of the 1st of June 1965 said,
We can be certain he is either in A, Vietnam, B, Algeria, or C, Latin America.
Eventually, Fidel made a speech explaining the disappearance of Che, saying that the beloved son of Cuba had gone to fight for the cause elsewhere, but was alive and in good health. Despite their disagreements, there was enormous affection between the two men, and Che ended one letter to Fidel from Africa.
We will reflect honour on Cuba. Big hugs from all of us to you.
Big hugs? These two are leaders of the revolution and they're talking in Teletubby language. After 9 months in the Congo, Che was left with just 20 soldiers and a goat that refused to give any milk. So, reluctantly, he decided to pack up and return to Cuba, to plot an attempt at liberating somewhere else. His real desire was to create revolution in his home country of Argentina, but a guerrilla army there had only just been crushed. So instead, he decided to come here, Bolivia. He may have been thinking of building a base here so that he could move into Argentina afterwards. But before he could embark on his plan, he had to change his appearance again. Dr. Gutierrez went to see him and wrote later,
I decided to change his height. I also decided to change his face, increasing the distance between nose and chin. I made his hair recede at the temples, took away his widow's peak, and made prosthetic devices to make his teeth larger.
His small group trained in the jungle, living off monkeys and parrots. And when you look around, you think, how did this group of a few dozen people with no support in the country think that they could move from hiding in these hills to overthrowing a government that was nowhere near as fragile as the one in Cuba? The more isolated he became, the more Che tried to make up for being ineffective by urging ever greater sacrifices. In his diary, his summing up of one march went,
The march went well, except for the accident that cost Benjamin his life.
Tired and starving, they were forced to eat their horse, and the horse meat had one effect on the team that Che described.
That evening we sat at the campfire. Everyone was belching and farting. A veritable organ concert.
But throughout this time, he managed to smuggle out documents, including one that contained the famous line,
We need 2, 3, many Vietnams.
Something else similar to his time in Africa was the obsession of the CIA in finding out where he was. One report said,
Che Guevara is in Guatemala.
Then an FBI report stated
Che Guevara died trying to invade the Dominican Republic.
Another said he was in Zambia, one that he'd been murdered by the Russians for supporting China, others said he was in Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, and that he died in a fight with Fidel. The most daring raid took place in this town, Samaipata, where after a gunfight the rebels took over the garrison here. The strategic reason for this was to get to this building as it was a chemist's, because Che had run out of inhalers. This was at least a propaganda victory until they got back to their camp and realised that they'd left the medicine at the barracks. Nonetheless, the official Bolivian army went to great lengths to crush the rebels, and on October the 8th, 1967, Che's platoon was surrounded and attacked by mortar bombs near the village of La Higuera. After a gunfight, Che was captured. Che was taken to Felix Rodriguez, who was leader of the government forces in that region, who, having failed to overturn the revolution in Cuba, was now trying to stop the rebels in Bolivia. Che was executed, and his hands were removed as proof that they'd finally got him. And he was brought here to this hospital laundry room in Valle Grande, where he was laid out on this sink, which fittingly has created possibly the humblest tourist attraction in the world. Despite the efforts to depict him as ruthless and heartless, Che has survived as the epitome of cool rebellion. Maybe that's because now, more than ever, all over the world, most politicians are seen as people who are just out for themselves, whereas Che represented the pinnacle of selflessness. Perhaps the nature of him is evident even from his images, that despite his capacity to be ruthless and dedicated, he also said,
Strange as it may seem, it is impossible to be an effective revolutionary if you are not capable of the greatest love.
He visited his wife and their 3-year-old daughter, but he couldn't reveal to his daughter that he was her father, as that would ruin all the security arrangements. So he asked her to give him a kiss and told her that he would be seeing her father and would pass it on. His daughter kissed him and then ran to her mother and said,
Mama, I think that old man's in love with me.
20 years after his death, the area of Niacahuasu, where Che began his campaign in Bolivia, was still a security zone with nobody allowed near it. But the moment he died, his following became more fervent than ever. The nuns in this hospital said that his image looked almost Christ-like, and in Cuba itself his image went up everywhere, and now you can buy almost any Che knick-knack you like. Maradona has a Che tattoo, as does Mike Tyson, which makes sense because iron discipline and rigid self-restraint have always been their most prominent qualities. But the cult of Che isn't just cynical or naive. At the very least, to align yourself with him is to identify with rebellion and passion. So Madonna and Jay-Z can wear a Che t-shirt, but Bush or Blair couldn't. Perhaps the most ridiculous attempt to cash in on his name was the film of his life starring Omar Sharif as Che, which was apparently so bad that when it was shown in Argentina and Chile, Molotov cocktails were thrown at the screen.
Is that a Molotov cocktail?
Yeah, I'll have a Molotov cocktail, thank you. It's very much nice.
And as they were throwing them, I bet the people were going, it's what he would have wanted.
If you'd like to start a revolution in your head, why not log on to open2.net?